for those of you who are new, please stay around afterwards and find out more about us and how you can get involved, or go to our website, newcastleinstitute.org.au. So this is a new old venue. You'll remember that we used to meet here before COVID. We've been meeting at Adamstown Rosebuds or Newcastle United Sports Club. For various reasons, we've come back here, and we anticipate that we'll be continuing on meeting here. Well, we were wondering about what numbers we would get, and we're delighted to have got the numbers we've got, so that's great. And it's great, after all the disruption of the last couple of years, it's fantastic that, to know that what we've been trying to do is worthwhile. So what are we trying to do? Well, here we are in Newcastle, and Newcastle has been a place of learning and exchange of ideas for thousands of years, with the traditional owners that we acknowledge, the Wabakal and the Warramai people, no doubt exchanging ideas themselves. And then the people who have come afterwards from 1797 onwards, learning and sharing ideas, and we need to keep on doing that. And we have particular challenges in Newcastle facing the future, because Newcastle has traditionally been based on coal, and it is very much still a large part of our community and our economy is coal. But there are questions being asked about that. There's the rise of different forms of energy, renewable energy, and arguments interminably about the science of that, about whether this can provide a stable electricity supply, about the economics of it, whether it will ever be anything other than unpredictable energy, and we're uncertain of what the facts are. And at the same time, how will this happen? What are the plans? We know that governments are making plans at the federal level. The outgoing, or as it turned out, outgoing Liberal government promised to establish a green hydrogen hub in Newcastle, and many of us don't know what that is and would like to know more. And the new government has backed it and said they're going ahead with it as well. So what's all that about? At the state level, the current government has committed big money and big plans as well, in terms of coordinating other people's money around renewable energy zones. And what's all that about? And how does that fit into the equation? And then also, what will happen? What is the future of this for jobs in the region? What jobs are going to disappear, and what new jobs will there be? And what does this mean for the economy of our region? So there's lots of questions to be asked, and we've assembled a panel that I think would be hard to beat in terms of ability to answer those questions. So on my immediate left, is Jess Allen, who is Dr. Jess Allen, and she's a real doctor, not a medical doctor like me. She actually has a PhD. Yes, yep. And a chemical engineer and electrochemist, and doing a lot of research with the Newcastle Institute of Energy and Resources. Just checking the name there. About this area, across a variety of fields that will inform some of her talk. But I think over and above that is a really good science communicator. And is one of those people who can take really complex ideas and make it so that, at least for a brief moment, you think that you understood it. And then you go home, of course, and you think, now how did it go? But she's a real treasure in that regard, I think you'll agree, after you've heard her talk. And this is the order that they'll be speaking. Adam Clark now works in New South Wales Treasury, where he's the manager of planning and policy implementation around renewable energy zones. So in a sense, he is the person on the spot for rolling out the program of renewable energy zones across the state, and has got some exciting work there. It's also of interest. He's recently been awarded a Churchill Scholarship and will be travelling overseas to learn about similar developments going on overseas. And then in the middle, Warwick Jordan from the Hunter Jobs Alliance, which is a broad alliance of interest groups focusing on jobs in the Hunter. Warwick has an interesting pedigree. His grandfather worked at BHP, and Warwick himself started out as a tradie and has moved on from that through a variety of roles, including being a jobs ambassador for a while, funded by the federal government, and now, as I say, is the coordinator of the Hunter Jobs Alliance. So obviously he'll talk about all these issues from the jobs point of view. So I've talked for far too long. I'd like to ask Jess to give us her thoughts. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ross. Well, I'll try to live up to that glowing introduction. No pressure. So I'm Dr. Jessica Allen, University of Newcastle. So my background is chemical engineering and electrochemistry, which maybe we'll get to a little bit of that spark of understanding by the end of my talk. We'll see. But don't worry too much about the slides. They're mostly for me as a prompt, because I'm not sure if you'll be able to read them quite so well, especially at the back with the writing. So my field is electrochemical engineering. And basically the way I think about this is that all of our processes and manufacturing, everything that we've been doing to this point in the Industrial Revolution has been run from fossil fuels, right? Fossil fuels generate electricity, but they're also used directly as chemicals in a number of different processes. So the carbon and the hydrogen that is made up of those fossil fuels is used in processes. And historically, these processes have been 24/7. You have the fuel, you use the fuel. There's no intermittency, there's no variability, and everything runs off one optimized parameter. So that's how industry has always run in the past. And when we're moving into a new way of using energy, and we're not using fossil fuels, we're decarbonising, which is essentially not using fossil fuels anymore, we need to start using electricity instead, which fossil fuels are not electricity, they're chemical energy. So if we're coming from this point of instead having electricity for manufacturing, that takes a bit of the part of the puzzle. So we need electricity for manufacturing, but we also need heat, and a lot of that also is chemical. So it's a chemical reaction that happens with that fossil fuel. So instead, what we want to do is bridge that gap with electrochemical reactions. So we're using electricity to directly drive chemical processes. So we're cutting out the fossil fuel that sits in the middle of that. And that's where I like to focus my research, is on how to integrate renewable electricity with manufacturing and industry, which is going to be absolutely crucial, I think, in Newcastle and the Hunter, and in decarbonisation and green revolution in general. So a couple of different things that you might have heard of technology-wise. Batteries are an example of electrochemical technology. Things like fuel cells, electrolysis, and of course hydrogen. So Ross has specifically asked me to talk about hydrogen, so we're going to do a bit of hydrogen 101. So hydrogen is an element by itself. Hydrogen, it's the most abundant element in the universe. And hydrogen, H2, you join two hydrogens together and you get hydrogen gas. Okay, so hydrogen, the element, compared to hydrogen, the gas. Now, hydrogen, the gas, is actually highly reactive, and it's not generally formed naturally. You can get natural hydrogen, but it's very difficult to form. The most abundant source of hydrogen on the planet is actually water. So water is highly stable. It doesn't really want to react with things, and so the hydrogen sticks around in the form of that water. So how do we get hydrogen from water? So water, being H2O, has hydrogen and it has oxygen. There are a couple of different ways we can do it. So the two main ones are using a middleman, essentially, so reacting water with something like coal or gas, so reacting it with that to get hydrogen. But of course, you've got carbon to begin with, so you also make CO2 in that reaction. Carbon's got to go somewhere. It doesn't just disappear, so it ends up as CO2. The other way is by putting in just energy into the water, right? So those two different pathways. Middleman, reacting the water with something, or just putting in a whole ton of energy. Doesn't like my memes. Here we go. So fossil fuels are essentially the crutch of hydrogen gas, because we use hydrogen already. We make hydrogen globally. It's a globally used and produced chemical gas industrially. So we use coal, so react it with the water to get hydrogen and CO2, or you can react it with the methane to get hydrogen and CO2. But as I said, you're getting CO2. So this isn't a decarbonised way to make hydrogen, and this isn't really the hydrogen that we talk about when we're talking about decarbonisation. But that's what we do at the moment. And where is hydrogen going at the moment? So we use it in industry, mostly. So it's used in things like making ammonia, which is a fertiliser that if we didn't have it, the population of the planet would be probably a few billion less. So in agriculture and farming, ammonia is absolutely crucial. And we get that hydrogen mostly from natural gas at the moment, a little bit of coal, although that's slowly been phased out, and a very small amount from the other part of the puzzle. So over the years, as I've said, we've used fossil fuels. They're easy, they're cheap, they allow a very optimised 24/7 process, but they also make CO2. So what do we need to do to step away from the fossil fuels? So the other way is putting in a whole heap of energy into the water, because water is very stable, it doesn't want to break apart. So to make it break apart, you have to put in energy. Two different types of energy that we can put in: electricity or heat. If you were to break water apart just using heat, you have to get to about 2,000 degrees Celsius, right? It's very, very hot. I was just at a conference, so they're doing some interesting things on catalysis and using catalysts to bring that temperature down. But anyway, that's an aside. Very high temperature, not super practical, and it's certainly not commercial yet. The one that's more interesting is electricity. And this is where electrochemical technology comes in. So electrochemistry can be used to force water to split into hydrogen and oxygen. But is it zero emission? So when you do electrolysis, you use electricity. Electricity is the input, hydrogen and oxygen are what come out of it. Where is the electricity coming from? If you plug it into the grid in New South Wales at the moment, it is not going to be zero emission hydrogen, because it first have to make the electricity by burning fossil fuels. And actually the emission intensity of doing that, of making hydrogen, is so much worse than just burning the fossil fuels for electricity, right? Because you have to go through a whole heap of different energy transformations before you get to the hydrogen. Whereas if you did it in Tasmania, where it's mostly hydro energy, so it's already a grid that's green, that's renewable, and it doesn't have emissions associated with it, then it is green hydrogen. So you can start to see a bit of the nuance in this discussion. And you can also make it directly from renewables. So one of the selling points of electrochemical reactions and electrolysis is that unlike big power plants, they're quite small, they're modular, and they're very on-off. There's a bit of ramping involved, but compared to a coal-fired power station and things using thermal heat, so that have to get to a certain temperature, they have to cool down, you cannot turn them on and off, right? It's very difficult. Compared to something like electrolysis, where you put the current in, you're splitting the water, right? It happens almost instantaneously, depending on the setup. So it works very well with the embedded renewables, because you can make hydrogen using renewable electricity directly. So the only emissions in that case, because technology doesn't grow on trees, is from the materials you have to begin with, right? So you've got to make the electrolyser, you've got to make the photovoltaics to begin with. You've got an upfront carbon penalty for all hydrogen technology, because what we do now, when we make the technology now, it's in the system we're in now. So we're making electrolysers, we're making solar panels in an economy and in a grid where we're emitting carbon dioxide. So we have that upfront emission penalty that we have to pay, and from then on, we don't have any more emissions. So that is definitely a consideration. And so people like to colour code hydrogen. Has anyone heard of green hydrogen? Blue hydrogen? grey hydrogen, pink hydrogen, turquoise hydrogen, teal. There's all different kinds. People love to put colours. It is not a different coloured gas. Okay, hydrogen is not green, it is colourless. So it's a classification system. The main ones I talk about, because I don't like to confuse things, is green, grey and blue. So green hydrogen is what we were talking about, this decarbonised approach. You're using renewable electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. Okay? No carbon involved at any step of that process. Then you've got your grey hydrogen, which was the first one I was talking about, using fossil fuels. Some people say it's just from natural gas for grey and you use brown for coal, but anyway, the dark colour, the grey and the brown, is from fossil fuels. So you're making the hydrogen the way we've made it all this time, right? You're just releasing the CO2. The blue hydrogen is another important one because in this one we're using fossil fuels still, so it's not decarbonised, but the carbon dioxide that's generated from that process is captured and sequestered. So the idea is to have a relatively carbon neutral pathway for hydrogen, but that is not green hydrogen and it's not decarbonised hydrogen, right? There's that difference between not having fossil fuels involved at all in any part of the production process compared to when you're using blue hydrogen and capturing the carbon dioxide. So there's a global vision for green hydrogen use. We talked about how you make it, so electrolysis or green, blue and grey. But if we're making a whole heap of green hydrogen, which is what internationally is most sort of spoken about, so that's the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA. And there's a whole heap of different places we can use hydrogen. So hydrogen itself is just an energy carrier. It's a fuel. So you can use it for energy storage. You make hydrogen while the sun shines, and then you can use it while the sun is not there, when the sun's gone down at night. You basically use it in exactly the opposite reaction to an electrolyser. So in an electrolyser, you put electricity and water in, and you get hydrogen and oxygen out. If you want to use the hydrogen to make electricity, you put it into a fuel cell, and you put the hydrogen and oxygen in, you get water and electricity out. So it's sort of a bookend approach to that. So that's the storage side. But you can see there's also a lot of other applications there, including, well, maybe you can't all the way at the back there, but there's a lot of other applications, including in industry, which is another point I want to talk about today. But firstly, to compare with the Australian, so this is the Australian vision for hydrogen use. These are a couple of years old now, which is actually relatively significant in terms of energy policy and energy terms. But you can see, maybe, with the Australian policy that they're still considering blue hydrogen. So blue hydrogen is still on the table compared to internationally. There's a lot more focus on green. So there's electrolysis as well as coal and steam reforming. And the applications are also very similar. The ones that I'm going to touch on today, well, I've got time, are ammonia and steel. I've talked briefly about storage as well, but there's a bit of a push-pull with hydrogen because you can use it to make a fuel which we can export, right? So that's something that we can do. We can make all of the hydrogen here and then send it to where it needs to go. And there are a lot of countries that would benefit hugely from that because they do not have the same capacity to make that green energy that we have here in Australia because of the renewable energy and also the land. So our resource for renewables as well as our land to place the technology gives us an advantage to make a large amount of energy that we can then export as hydrogen. So that's one way. But we could also export products. So we can use hydrogen and then in a manufacturing process and then export, instead of exporting the hydrogen, we export the product itself. So there's a bit of a balance there because, you know, exporting a lot of hydrogen and then using it overseas is not a very efficient way to use energy because you have to compress it, put it on a ship, transport it, they use it on the other end. There's still debate about how it should be transported. And you lose a lot of energy that way. So you need a lot more renewables to make up for that transportation step to get the same amount of energy out at the end. Whereas what we can do here in Australia quite efficiently is make the hydrogen and then potentially use it directly in manufacturing. I won't talk about that one because I'm running out. So I'll just talk briefly about ammonia. So we actually have a plant in Newcastle that makes ammonia. They make ammonia for explosives, actually, for the mining industry. But ammonia is a really interesting chemical moving forward because it's been identified as a potential replacement for diesel bunker fuel that's used in international shipping. So there's not a lot of alternatives to decarbonise that global shipping trade. Compared to that bunker fuel. You can't use batteries, they're too heavy. So actually hydrogen in the form of ammonia is a really promising decarbonised fuel in that industry. So there's potentially a growth in that industry. We have a port here, we have boats here that need to be refuelled, and if we want to have green shipping, potentially making that hydrogen into ammonia is one way to do that. There's a couple of different ways that you can make ammonia. Probably not everyone knows about all of them. The Haber-Bosch process is the most well-known. Basically, you have a really high temperature, high pressure, and you smush together the hydrogen and nitrogen. So nitrogen just from the air, you smush it together with hydrogen and you make ammonia. Okay, so it needs to happen under certain conditions. At the moment, they get their hydrogen from natural gas, so grey hydrogen, but you can replace that with green hydrogen without too many penalties of the whole overall plant. What I'm interested in, very future-looking research, is by cutting out the Haber-Bosch process altogether and just directly electrochemically making ammonia. But that's a story for another day. But one thing I do want to point out, which you might not be able to see on the slide, is that as you move away from fossil fuels and towards decarbonised energy, you actually need more electricity. So you need a lot more overall electricity input to make the same amount of ammonia. So our electricity demand for manufacturing is going to be quite large in that respect. But the more we decarbonise, the more electricity, renewable electricity, we're going to need. One more point, which is about green steel, before I hand over. So green steel is a really interesting opportunity for Australia. So we export a huge amount of iron ore overseas, and we also export a huge amount of coking coal overseas, and then we buy steel. So, we send our resources overseas to be processed and made into products that we then buy back. What if instead we could do processing of that material here in Australia and do it in a way that we're harnessing all of our renewable energy potential? Hydrogen is one possible way to do that. Now, there are three main ways to make steel. I'm not going to go hugely into detail, but basically the blast furnace is the main one. So that is a large furnace that uses coking coal. 70% of steel production is blast furnace, and the scale of steel production is almost mind-blowing in how large it is. So thinking about transitioning away from blast furnaces is a massive undertaking, and it's not one that's going to happen before 2030. Maybe 2050, we can work towards it, but 2030, no way. We're going to be using blast furnaces for a long time. The other alternative, so I've got electric arc furnace, but that's sort of intermingled between the other two as well. But the other main one is direct reduction method. So this is less used, but it has the biggest potential for green hydrogen. And I don't have too much time, but I just want to show a little bit about blast furnace decarbonisation. You probably can't see too much there. So when we make steel, you start off with iron oxide. So iron oxide is a combination of iron, which is used in steel, and oxygen. To make steel, you need to pull that iron away from the iron oxide, right? So to do that, what they do is they mix it in with coking coal, with carbon, and they basically just oxidise the oxygen, so turn it into carbon dioxide. So the coal is involved in the reaction and it pulls that oxygen away, and what's left is the iron, right? So the iron melts away and is collected for later steel making. So it's actually an intrinsic chemical reactant for the process. We're not using coal for electricity for steel making. We're reacting iron oxide with coal so that we can make steel. So there's a couple of different approaches and thoughts around decarbonising this reaction, and hydrogen is one of them. So remember, we've got the iron and the oxygen. We want to pull the oxygen away. So if we, instead of putting carbon in, if we put hydrogen in, what are we going to make at the end? Water. Right? So you can use hydrogen as a replacement, potentially, for coke. That's not going to work in a blast furnace, though, because the coke actually forms part of it. It's a solid gas, liquid mixture. It's sort of more art than science, blast furnace manufacturing, from what I can make out. So there's quite a lot going on. But you can supplement the gases that are put in some hydrogen, start mixing it up, capture the CO2, start replacing the coke with bio-derived components, so other types of carbon or even waste products. But that technology is probably going to be quite reliant on carbon capture and storage as well to decarbonise. The one that is more interesting for hydrogen is the direct reduction method. So the direct reduction method is not between the solid gas liquid, so it's between the solid, the iron oxide, and a gas. And basically what it does is it reforms methane, they have done it on coal, and does that middleman reaction. So it reacts the fossil fuel with water to make hydrogen, and the hydrogen does the work, right? So it's already doing that reforming reaction. It does also have this carbon monoxide, and there's still carbon in the furnace, and all of the reactions are a bit different. So it's not actually a decarbonised pathway, but it's lower emission, and there is potential that we could replace that methane with green hydrogen. There's been some demonstrations of this internationally. It's quite difficult to do because the reactions and the heat flows are all very different, but it is doable, so they're moving forward with that. The only challenge with direct reduced iron is that the iron ore that you use has to be very pure, because you basically dump just all of it into the furnace, so it has a really huge heat penalty. So what you want to do is get it as pure as possible, so you're only heating up the bit that needs to be heated up. But it is an interesting technology moving forward that if we decarbonise, this is the decarbonised one, don't worry about that, but just think about it, so that we've got this blast furnace compared to direct reduction method. The blast furnace we're not going to be able to completely replace or decarbonise, but we can offset the emissions using hydrogen, and then moving forward we can do things like this direct reduction method, purifying the ore. There's lots of projects in that area at the moment getting the ore to the right point, the Australian ore, that we can do direct reduction. And the one I'm more interested in, which is probably not going to happen until 2030, 2040, which I don't have a slide on, is direct electrolysis. So let's cut out all of the hydrogen, let's cut out all of the things in the middle and do it direct electrochemically. But that's a story for another day. So I guess my take-home points is just the basis for all green hydrogen, and the scale of this is, you know, it's almost unimaginable when you're thinking about exporting our energy. And replacing if you could ever replace the export market that we have now, it's just a huge amount of energy. And all of that has the basis of renewable electricity. Storage is crucial. It's going to be a balance of storage of electricity and things like batteries, but also storage of hydrogen for more seasonal variations. I didn't really talk too much about that, because I want to hand on to these guys and hear what they have to say. But also I think that bringing in industry demand management and flexible operation, you know, moving away from that 24/7 operation mode that we've been in for industry and going into this variability and working with flexible operation is what industry needs to be thinking about. And we don't really need hydrogen domestically. It's not really a point I've made, but we can just use the renewable electricity we have here, maybe a bit for storage, but really our role with hydrogen is around exporting products and exporting fuels. And yeah, we need to decarbonise industry through a variety of different pathways, not just electricity, it's also fuels and feedstocks. And that's all I have to say about that. Looking forward to questions later. I hope that made sense.
Oh, wow. It's sort of being on an intellectual roller coaster, isn't it? Yeah. Yep. Sorry. Oh, right. Yep. Okay, so it struck me while you were talking, and I'm sure there'll be someone who'll pick me up on the facts here, but we're saying, yeah, how is all this possible? But I think steel making was only invented in about 1860 or 18, like the Bessemer converter and the Bessemer process. It was the late 1800s, which I know is a long time ago now, but it's not actually all that long ago. Before that it was all iron, and to actually make it into steel and everything that's happened since, and for that matter, how long have we had these? Yeah, 13 years, I think. And it's so, you know, when you're talking 1840, 1850, 20, 30 years, a lot can change in 30 years. Anyway, all right, so we've had a bit of the basic science, and now Adam Clark is going to tell us about what's actually happening in New South Wales and the plans around renewable energy zones and our plans for making the stuff here and shipping it around the state, I think, yeah, and what really is happening.
Is this working, Jess? Or no? Good evening, all. I'm not sure I've quite got the interactive slides that Jess had, but I'll see how I go. So I work for the Energy Corporation of New South Wales, or EnergyCo. Effectively, we're a newly established entity as of about 18 months ago, and we're an infrastructure planner for the state to deliver at the beginning at least 5 renewable energy zones across New South Wales, and also plan out the transmission that will connect these renewable energy zones. So part of our role in coordinating that is to also coordinate the generators, so solar, wind, pumped hydro developers, making sure they can connect to the existing grid and transfer that electricity back to the load centres like Newcastle, Sydney and Wollongong. So in terms, we also play in a pretty messy space as well. So while we're the infrastructure planner, we also have the Minister for Energy, who's also the Treasurer, Minister Keane, and he administers the Electricity Infrastructure Act under which this all operates. As I mentioned, we have the private developers that are developing these renewable energy projects across the state, and what we're trying to do is coordinate them in the right areas and make sure, as I mentioned, they have the right connections to get back. I won't go into too much detail on the others. So there's a consumer trustee that runs auctions each year to offer contracts to these generators as an incentive. The Department of Planning still assesses all these projects under their normal sort of assessment processes. And then obviously local councils that sit within these renewable energy zones have a very important role to play. So in terms of the energy transition, we obviously know that a lot of the coal-fired power stations are reaching the end of their technical life. So we have an existing sort of time frame. So in New South Wales, 4 of the 5 remaining coal-fired power stations are scheduled to close. It was in 15 years. It's probably just over 10 at the moment now. So that started off with Liddell, which closed down its first generator this year and will finish its full closure next year. We've had a recent announcement from Origin that Eraring closure is likely to be brought forward by about 7 years. So that target date now is 2025. We have Bayswater making announcements of bringing its closure date forward as well to between 2030 and 2033. So what that means is we have quite a lot of existing generation in New South Wales that has to be replaced in a pretty rapid time frame. So what we know in that regard in terms of replacing the existing generation, obviously the electricity grid in New South Wales was developed at a time when we had very centralised power generation. So the grid was connecting these power stations in the Upper Hunter and in Lake Macquarie, and it was delivering that, quite directly to the load centres, as I mentioned, so Newcastle, Sydney and Wollongong. What we see now, though, is that as renewable generation is looking to replace these assets, it's more decentralised. So it's going to the places where there's a lot better solar resource, so out west, or a lot better wind resource, such as up in New England, etc. And it means that the existing grid isn't necessarily designed to connect those assets. So what we've found is there's capacity constraints in that existing network, and we need to start looking at options to deliver new lines to connect those projects and bring that power into the system. So this, I won't cover everything on this and very hard to see, but We also have the Australian Energy Market Operator, which sort of oversees strategically the national electricity market, which connects South Australia, which connects Victoria, New South Wales, Tasmania and Queensland. And they deliver what's called an integrated system plan, or an ISP. So we've just recently had the latest 2022 ISP delivered in June. And what this looks at is what is the generation capacity that's going to be needed, you know, for the short, medium and long term. What's the new transmission infrastructure that's going to be needed within each of the states, and the sort of timing that needs to come online. So picking out, and again that's a bit difficult to see, but picking out some of the interesting things as well is they see a very rapid shift to renewables in our grid, and you know, opportunities of what we need to do to manage that, but also a very rapid uptake continuing in Australia for things like rooftop solar, so DER, distributed energy resources. So we're seeing, while we're looking at these big projects and how we connect that, we're continuing to see you know, massive uptake of solar and things like that on households and in businesses. And that presents, you know, a number of other sort of challenges in how you manage that, that generation in the local grid as well. One of the other interesting things that we will start to see is a lot of battery storage at the smaller scale as well. So not just these big sort of projects that you might have seen in Victoria, etc., that Elon Musk had a bet on a few years ago, but also, you know, household batteries, and increasingly in the future things like batteries in vehicles. So there's a lot of interesting work, I guess, happening here and overseas about what's called vehicle to grid, where you can, you know, potentially use that power in a vehicle and put it back into your house or into the grid, which could play a very important role in terms of, you know, just imagine you're driving to work in an electric vehicle, it's sunny, it's during the day, you could charge up at work, maybe that's an incentive by your employer or something like that. You get home, that's when the peak grid is under sort of constraint. You know, if all these vehicles, you know, manage to plug in and put some power back into the home for a couple of hours and ride through that, it could then sort of charge overnight when there's a lot more sort of energy generation available. So what that means in terms of that transition and what the role that Energy Corporation and the New South Wales Government is looking at is taking that sort of national market approach from AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator, and looking at what needs to be done in New South Wales in terms of new transmission and these renewable energy zones. So to explain a bit more what a renewable energy zone is, basically it is the coordination and connecting of multiple generation assets in a zone. So as I mentioned earlier, solar and wind, but also things like battery storage and pumped hydro, which is long duration storage. And so for those not familiar with pumped hydro, it's effectively using two existing dams at different heights. It's pumping the water up the hill when there's a lot of energy in the system, such as solar during the day. And when there's a shortfall in the grid, it runs that water back down through pipes, which spins a turbine and basically puts energy back into the system. Now there's a bit of losses associated with that from the pumping, so the round trip efficiency. But what that means is if there's excess renewables, you know, it's effectively free energy, so that can be put and stored for longer duration. And it's sort of a big part, I guess, of the puzzle in terms of not just looking at things like lithium-ion batteries, which you'd be familiar in, you know, mobile phones and all kinds of devices, but also how do we produce power for a lot longer periods. So these renewable energy zones, they coordinate that generation in specific areas. We, as the infrastructure planner, look at building new lines, so new transmission lines to connect those generation, and then we connect it back to the existing grid. So again, looking up there, that the sort of top section is sort of private investment, which we know there's a lot of interest from the renewable energy market. Sort of middle spine there, the purple section is the new infrastructure that we need to plan and build, and the rest of it is the existing grid. So in terms of the renewable energy zones in New South Wales, it's something that's been sort of underway and developed since the legislation came in late 2020. We're now seeing it as a very common way to address energy shortfalls. So Victoria has recently released their sort of plan around renewable energy zones as well. But in New South Wales, we have 5 that we're currently developing. The most progressed, which was originally the sort of pilot zone, is in the central west Orana region, so out near Dubbo and Mudgee and up around Warrumbungles. We have the New England Renewable Energy Zone, which has quite a lot of wind resources as well. The southwest zone, which is part of a zone where a big transmission line's already been planned, so Project Energy Connect, which is going to help transfer power between South Australia and New South Wales, and also another interconnector with Victoria. And then the 2 sort of most recent zones that we're working on, or the coastal zones, so the Hunter Central Coast Renewable Energy Zone, which we've been working quite a lot on recently, and the Illawarra, which is recently sort of gone out to a registration of interest. So in terms of the targets of what we're looking to do, we're looking to bring on 12 gigawatts of capacity by 2030 to replace existing coal-fired fleet that are retiring, and also have a target of 2 gigawatts of long-duration storage. And that's sort of to get us through this initial period of replacing existing generation. When we start to talk about things like green hydrogen and electric vehicles and all other kind of, emerging technology that's going to require more energy, we're obviously going to have to plan out what that looks like over the next sort of 20, 30 years as well. I'll go for time. So in terms of these registration of interest, as I mentioned earlier, we've seen quite a lot of market interest to build solar and wind, providing the infrastructures there. So for each of these reses, as we develop it, we run this market process. We ask for developers what projects they're considering. And over the 4 that we've run so far, so Central West, New England, Southwest, and the Hunter Central Coast, we've had, huge amounts of interest, 135 gigawatts of capacity. As I mentioned, our target's 12, so we know there's a strong interest. We know not all of these are going to get built, but to see that, you only have to convert 1 in 10 of those projects and we meet our target for now, that's really encouraging. And also 190 gigawatt hours of storage potential, so that's both pumped hydro, as I mentioned earlier, but also battery storage as well. Some interesting notes as well with the Hunter Central Coast. We're seeing strong interest in offshore wind. So we had 7 projects come in, which equated to double our target of 12 gigawatts. And that's going to take a bit longer to develop over time, obviously, but it has a lot of other advantages in terms of consistency of its generation. It's blowing offshore a lot of the time when there might be wind droughts onshore. And the projects we're talking about are, 20, 30 kilometres offshore, so it's not like they're in your sort of eyesight on the shoreline there. Another sort of point, we had a lot of interest, obviously, in the Hunter Round hydrogen projects as well. So I'll just sort of skip through these pretty quickly, but in terms of that coordination piece that we're looking to play, it's delivering those transmission lines and what that means. It's working with all the generators to help connect and coordinate when they're going to come online and make sure that transmission's available in time. But also making sure we're working with the sort of local communities in those renewable energy zones, that, ensuring they see the benefit of hosting this infrastructure as well. What we see in terms of the challenge, obviously transmission lines, are not the most aesthetically pleasing infrastructure. So, there's a lot of work that's going on in terms of how do we minimise that impact, how do we try and plan it in areas that, might be sort of well screened or well hidden or on existing government land or mining land. How do we minimise impact on landowners? But in areas where we do have to sort of interact and cross over landowners' property, making sure there's, you know, compensation for hosting that infrastructure. So we've seen in the past, if someone's hosting a wind turbine or solar panels, they'll get sort of landowner payments. This is another sort of opportunity where they might get a secondary source of income. You know, it might only be a small area of their overall site, but they'll get those sort of payments associated with that. And also reinvesting some of this money back into the communities that are hosting it. So part of building this infrastructure and connecting these generators, they pay into a fund as well that goes into these community and employment purposes. How am I going, Ross? So in terms of Hunter Central Coast Renewable Energy Zone, as I mentioned, we've sort of been working hard on designing the geographic boundary of that, understanding where the projects are, trying to understand what infrastructure might be needed. So we're pretty close to bringing that out to a public exhibition where we'll sort of go out for consultation about the draft boundary and what's proposed. We've also announced a transmission acceleration fund, so when Eraring announced they're bringing forward their closure, we sort of put more funding into how do we accelerate this transition. So that transmission acceleration fund is putting towards building out these zones, but also accelerating things like the Hunter Transmission Project, which is looking to connect Eraring back to Bayswater and completing another sort of high voltage link there. We also announced the Waratah Super Battery. So I mentioned, you know, there was this battery down in South Australia a couple of years ago that was the world's biggest. It was 100 megawatt. This one we're proposing is 700 megawatt. So, you know, you can see how quickly this technology sort of advances. And what this battery does is it's not about how much energy it can store and release. It actually helps to unlock constraints in the network. So it's almost like an insurance policy that says you can continue to generate more energy, so it makes more use of existing transmission, but if there's an issue, the battery will kick on. So it can sort of bring a lot more power into the system. I mentioned sort of offshore wind. We see that as a real sort of emerging opportunity over the medium term. We're seeing interest in the Hunter and Central Coast, but also down in the Illawarra. The benefits, as well as sort of employment and things that I talked about, is it's connecting directly into these large load centres where we have the likes of Tomago and Molycop and InfraBuild and BHP, BlueScope down in Illawarra. There's also a range, I guess, you know, the renewable energy program is sort of one piece of the puzzle, but there's a whole range of other sort of government programs that we look to coordinate together. So things like clean manufacturing precincts, so funding to help existing industry decarbonise and cluster and benefit from having those clean manufacturing precincts. The hydrogen hubs program, so both the Hunter and Illawarra nominated hydrogen hubs. Government's recently gone through a shortlisting process for that. So now there's a number of projects in the Hunter that are on that shortlist to go to a formal sort of proposal, and similar down in the Illawarra. Renewable manufacturing, so back in February, again at the time of the Eraring announcement, there was a $250 million renewable manufacturing fund that was announced. It's still sort of getting developed in terms of what that will be put towards, but effectively it's helping industry decarbonise, again, their manufacturing capabilities. And finally, we also have a clean technology innovation program, so looking at what are some of the emerging technologies, how can we support those to scale up and become commercially available to assist in that process. So I'll leave it there, and yeah, happy to answer some questions at the end there. Thanks, Ross.
Yeah, again, you just think this is actually all happening. You know, it's like it's been a big secret, and in the meantime, the newspaper continues with the argument about, you know, whether it can actually work or not. when we come to questions, I'll put one question on notice. Could you give us some idea, you might have to Google this while Warwick's talking, of just like how big a solar farm do you need to replace Araring or whatever? Like, does that mean you need to cover half of New South Wales or whatever? But anyway, you can give. I'll let you think about that. So now Warwick's going to tell us about his thoughts on behalf of the Hunter Jobs Alliance about the job implications of this, what jobs will disappear and what jobs will arise, and how we're going to transition in that. So thanks, Warwick.
Thanks, Ross. No memes or slides from me, unfortunately. Look, so I think as a starting point, what we'd say about this job transition or the economic change that we're seeing is three things. So one, as these guys have ably demonstrated and Ross spoke to, it is happening. Secondly, there are things that we can do about it. And thirdly, it is going to be complicated. It is going to be difficult. And to flesh those out a little bit, we can clearly see what's happening as far as our domestic energy generation. I think there's various takes about some of our thermal export mining and what's going to happen there, but there's enough indications about a trajectory of change, whether that's over the medium or the long term. But the critical importance of that sector for our economy and for jobs in the region means that it's something we need to take really seriously. And as we see some of the technology shifts that Jess and Adam have been speaking about, these things are happening now. So it's gone, I think, pretty rapidly from something that was seen as a debate or a question to something that, from the people we talk to in the region and what the data tells us as far as our social research, that most people in the region are seeing that something is happening. I think the second thing that's really important, we do have a bit of a tendency, because some of these issues are associated with political or environmental or climate issues, that they're all the solutions are brand new to these things, but we have 50, 60 years of really good evidence about how to deal with these type of large structural economic changes in regions. And it doesn't all work. You know, a lot of people, obviously, Newcastle and the Hunter have lived through various changes, and there's been things that have happened in other places as well. But we know there's a set of things that can be done, and we're well placed to learn from those. I think the other aspect is just around the complexity. I think we do need to get away from this idea that people will finish work in a pit on Friday arvo and rock up in a hydrogen factory on Monday. You know, that's not how these things work as far as a structural change, and I think it does a bit of a disservice as far as some of the public conversation about that. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be positive or optimistic about what we can do about these things, but we do need to acknowledge the reality of how these things work. And so I just wanted to make just a few comments about the three areas that we've identified and people from other regions or people we talk to in the Hunter have told us that are really critical. So the first one, and I think this gets neglected a little bit, there was a really interesting study that was done a couple of years ago. There's a couple of people from the University of South Australia, a professor called Andrew Beer, who's been to Newcastle a few times, and his colleague Sally Weller. And these guys have been working with and studying various regions, different industries, employers, workers for probably 50 years combined, whether that's textile, clothing and footwear, whether that's the automotive industry in South Australia or Victoria, whether that's power generation in Latrobe Valley, and looked at all of those things that can be done and can be put in place. And they did a study a couple of years ago. There was a group put together by Muswellbrook Council that involved unions, employers, mines, business groups, and they got these guys up to do a bit of work. And they looked through what's everything that could be done as far as supporting community, supporting workers, attracting investment, attracting new jobs. The number one conclusion that they came to was about what the experts call procedural justice. But at the end of the day, what it means is that everything that could be done to help people through these changes is being done. And that's half the battle. It gives people confidence that there's support there. And I think something we found is people don't necessarily want the big silver bullet to come over the top. They want to be supported through options to make their own choices and work out what their working lives are going to look like. And there's a lot of things that we don't do very well in Australia or New South Wales, and there are some gaps around that, particularly around having worker support services, having the right type of retraining, having that type of advice. And a lot of those things are, in some ways, the hardest from the perspective of people's jobs and livelihoods and families, but from a policy point of view, they're probably actually the easiest things to do, but we don't do them well, and that's a big part of what the Jobs Alliance advocates for, is if we can get those things in place, then we've started. The second thing, which is really, really important, is the actual structural change in our economy. So we know that manufacturing, we know that mining, we know that energy generation underpins a lot of the value-added export generating or high income generating industries in our economy. And it's not like the sky's falling in. It's not like things are going to collapse tomorrow. If we get this right, things will roll through over time. But we do need to be aware that these changes that are happening around energy, around mining, are coming in the context of broader changes in our economy. We all know how different people's working lives are, the type of industries people are in these days compared to what they were 30 or 40 years ago, and those changes are continuing. And so we need to have that really firm eye. And I guess where we're always looking to is these things are difficult. Essentially what we're trying to do is bend the arc of an economic change or a structural change in a region and make that work for people and make that work for the generation of income. And there's a lot of things that we can do around the margins a lot better that Australia, New South Wales historically hasn't been that good at. And we are seeing, credit where credit's due. I think we are seeing some really good responses, or at least the beginnings of some of those responses. But it's some of the basics, like there has been a couple of manufacturers looking to employ 40, 50 people, looking for an opportunity in the Upper Hunter, can't find a zoned piece of dirt, can't find a bit of industrial land to be able to go and set up. And so maybe there's not going to be a flood of new enterprises coming to the region, but we'll never know if there's not a place to put them and we don't have a coherent way of doing that. It's a similar issue with our skills and training sector. A lot of people would obviously be familiar with some of the challenges there. If we're putting our hand up as far as a region that is going to attract these new industries, we don't necessarily know exactly what the jobs are going to be, because some of these industries are growing over time, hydrogen, renewable energy zones, but we need to be able to demonstrate to investors and also to young people looking to access these industries what those pathways look like. And that means some serious improvements in terms of our vocational education system. And there's other things like investment attraction and so on, which aren't really front page of the paper type things. It's not the sexy stuff, but you want to be able to have that funnel where investors are coming to governments or coming to your development agencies and saying, we're looking at doing X, Y or Z, what have you got for us? And you need to be able to say to them straight away, we've got this piece of land, we've got this skilled workforce capacity, we've got this ability, we'll have someone who'll meet you at 9 o'clock at Newcastle Airport next Tuesday and show you around. And so those kind of things around the margins are really, really critical, and that will be what will help us make use of those much vaunted advantages that we talk about as far as our infrastructure, our land, our skills, the capacity that we have in our SMEs and our engineering shops and all those type of things. But you need to get those other parts of it right to be able to do that. And then the third part of the picture is when we're looking at opportunities like hydrogen and we're looking at things that are happening like renewable energy zones, there's trade-offs involved in these type of things, but some of these sectors are incredibly competitive. We know there's things that will happen. We need a lot of renewable energy built, and we need to do that in the right way, as Adam pointed out, so that we don't hit those constraints that we're seeing in countries like South Korea or Germany, where the rollout started to happen and then it starts to slow as you have people being concerned about what it looks like or what the impacts will be. And I think there's partially education, but also some of the initiatives that have been talked about as far as bringing people along are important. We know those things are going to happen. Part of the challenge there is leveraging as much as we can. What are the job opportunities going to be, and how do we ensure things like local content and local employment works? I think there's a really good cautionary tale from the UK around these type of developments where 15 years ago, when offshore wind started as an industry in the UK, there was lots of fanfare. You think about the type of places that some of these wind farms were going in. It was Scotland, north of England, had generations worth of challenges as far as changes to their manufacturing industry or tailing off of oil and gas and so on. And so there was lots of positive coverage and a big game talked about the job opportunities and so on. But what happened in the first couple of wind farms was that about 10% of the content that was put into those farms was local and the rest of it came from overseas. And so a lot of the benefits weren't realised, and so that created a backlash in those communities because they were sold a story about what was going to happen. And so then the government came in, and part of it was a function of scale. When you have more scale, you can make more things. But what the government did on the back of that was to create requirements around local content as part of their auction process for those offshore wind farms, and then did some, I guess what we used to call industry policy, but essentially engagement with industry about how they drive that local content. And now they're up at about 50% of local content. They're onshoring the building of wind turbines, a lot of the electrical components, those type of things, and that's continuing to grow in terms of local content. So there are things that can be done, and we need to recognise that these industries are extremely competitive. There are, I don't know, Jess, how many countries around the world or regions in Australia trying to get a piece of the pie for hydrogen, and our advantages are really solid, but there'd be hundreds of places around the world that are similarly situated, and so we've really got to make use of those, make sure we're in the race. So there's that competitiveness side, but there's also making sure that we're making use of what we have here as far as our skills, and making sure that the policy environment is actually driving towards those jobs rather than ending up with a lot of content which might keep the lights on and keep industry rolling, but may not necessarily deliver that jobs dividend. So there's things that will happen, but there's a lot of choices that we can make in there around how we support workers and communities and give them that procedural justice. And that's where we should be starting, because in a lot of ways that's a low-hanging fruit, and it's a frustration that we haven't nailed that yet. We are making some progress. Secondly, it's about putting our best foot forward and actually making use of those assets that we have here to make sure we've still got those assets generating income in our economy. And then thirdly, making sure that we're getting the most value for local businesses and local jobs out of the things that are happening. Thanks.
Okay, now thanks for that. Rob, do you want to do the roving mic? This is all. And actually, while people are putting their questions together, Adam, questions about the size of the renewable energy zones, and sorry, how big does a solar farm have to be to to be competitive. Or
There's a beer coaster back here that he's been working on for the last 10 minutes.
Trying to avoid the feedback. I did some quick maths on that one. I think in New South Wales we have about 80 million square hectare, 80 million hectares.
that's the total area of the
Total
state.
area of the state. I could be wrong on that one, but let's hope it's close enough. In terms of, so if we were to cover all that in solar panels, we would get something like 28,000 gigawatts of solar. So that's a huge amount. I guess what's happening at the moment is concern, rightly, in some of the inland reses about impacts on rural farmland and things like that. So there's a review happening at the moment by the New South Wales Ag Commissioner, but I think anecdotally, just looking at those, sort of rural zones, it's in a order of a couple of % of that total land mass. So yeah, we're not talking half the state, but also where solar is good for some things, but we're also going to need quite a lot of wind generation, and it has a much wider area but a much smaller footprint, I guess. So it's not like you can't do anything else in those areas. And also we're seeing, I guess, with solar, the emergence of kind of I don't know whether what's the right term, but kind of renewables and agriculture where you can, they can coexist on a number of fronts. So a solar farm out here, we've got, sheep running around still, and there's benefits associated with that. But I just saw the other day people growing things like strawberries and other sort of things under panels. So I think we'll see an emergence of that as well.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, if you just put your hands up and ask questions. And just in passing, we're still learning how to get back in here. At the end of the night, we might ask whether you'd prefer the speakers to be on a stage or like this. So anyway, but we'll be looking for feedback at the end of the night. Anyway, go on.
My name is Sam Reich, and I wanted to thank the panelists and the Newcastle Institute for bringing this topic to the fore. It's fascinating. I was actually reading some Facebook posts that were reacting to, or comments that were reacting to the news that the federal government had said that they were going to back the previous government's commitment to Newcastle as a renewable energy zone. And some of the comments were the usual social media negative things, but there was one comment in particular that caught my eye from someone who reacted by saying, they're not talking about how complicated this is all going to be and the technology that's involved and all of the various challenges and aspects. And looking at Adam's presentation in particular, every one of those multiple projects has got huge numbers of complicated aspects to it, and technology and science. Maybe I'd like to know how much of it is achievable. It's just a matter of doing it and funding it, and how much are we still hoping for future breakthroughs in science to get us there?
Yeah, thanks for your question. I think largely I would say that the technology is not new at all. So it's so well established that we have the technology today. It's a question of how rapidly can we roll that out, and that comes down to things like planning processes and, as we sort of mentioned, picking the right spots, making sure we're assessing land use conflicts, making sure we're bringing communities on board in these kind of areas. So from a technology perspective, no, I don't think there's any consideration that that's a problem. It's more about how quickly we can roll this out to replace that existing generation capacity. Yes.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, definitely agree with Adam. So we've had the technology for a really long time, and most of the stuff we do in research is about incremental improvements, trying to make little changes so that maybe you use less land area for the same amount of energy, making hydrogen production more efficient. But the technology, the basis of the technology is there for the vast majority, definitely electricity generation, baseload power, all of that stuff that you talk about. The more difficult things are the ones I was talking about that I want to work on in the future, of sort of making things completely decarbonised, or making it basically cheaper and more efficient to do the things that we already do now. Yeah.
Add a comment to that. So in terms of, I mentioned, how quickly we can roll it out. I think.
Sorry.
That one working? Yep. One of the other challenges we're definitely going to see is around supply. So supply chain constraints we've seen over in Europe. They are going massive in terms of what they're looking to roll out for renewable energy. So that's going to be one of the other big areas. Can we get the equipment? Can we get the what we need to roll this out?
Hello, my name's Grant Sefton. I particularly appreciate all the contributions, but I like Warwick's comment tonight about looking at strategic advantage and being a little bit parochial about it. I'd just like thoughts from the panel about what really is our strategic advantage in the Hunter Valley. I know it's been touched on perhaps by all, but it's a really important question about really how do we effectively compete with other regions in Australia to find our strategic advantage for green energy.
Yeah, look, I think we start from a good place as far as having infrastructure. Obviously, the logistics of having the port in particular is a huge advantage. I think, notwithstanding some of those comments I made about difficulties in the planning system and zoning of employment lands, I think we do have more capacity to grow and use land. So I think that's a good baseline starting point. And we have a large population compared to a lot of the regions that are looking to be competitive in this. So you look at northwest WA, for example, or even parts of Queensland. With Tassie are probably our main competitors domestically around hydrogen, and we have that base in terms of our skilled workforce and also the capacity we have in our economy. But I think the things that are interesting.
Yeah, sorry.
Alternatively, we will just get some more batteries. Can we use that microphone for a sec, Ross?
How's that? Excellent. Third time's a charm. So look, I think as far as what are the specific comparative advantages or competitive advantages that we have on top of those baseline assets that probably put us at a level of some of the other regions, I think those export and trade relationships are really, really significant. And I think being able to leverage those is really, really important. That level of trust that comes with dealing with places like South Korea and Japan that we know are on these decarbonisation trajectories, that's really important as far as reducing transaction costs for those people looking to buy, but also making use of what we have there. I think even though we've obviously have a manufacturing sector that's diminished over time, we still have a really solid manufacturing base, and the number of smart people who are out there in engineering shops, whether that's in some of the flag bearers like AMP Controls of the world, or whether it's in other people who are working in coal or defence supply chains or what have you. There's just some really great organisations out there, and I think making the advantage we have there is really critical as well. So I think that's probably the set that comes to mind from my end.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And, we've got the port, we've got the export, we've got the relationships that are there. But I think you made a really good point, Warwick, about being ready to sort of deploy or to to attract industry to Newcastle and to rebuild that manufacturing base. But I also just wanted to make the point that, Newcastle is home to the CSIRO Energy Centre, and it's the centre of energy research in all of Australia is here in Newcastle, right? They could have chosen to put it anywhere, but it's in Newcastle. So we've got that, and then obviously we've got the university and researchers there. But I think that we've got a good community of sort of research, industry, government collaboration that can sort of work together to push forward these more innovative ideas, hopefully, I think, and startup culture that's coming out as well.
And that reminds me, before I go to Adam, the other one that's just really obvious, which I totally forgotten, is that institutional capacity. The fact that the region now wants this and is putting our hand up, I think is something that shouldn't be discounted. When you have, it works in a tangible way when you're looking at the large mountains of money that are around from institutional and equity investors globally who are looking for, what they're calling ESG or climate risk compliant assets. When you have places that are putting their hand up and saying, look, we can see something's going on here, we've got some capacity to do something about it, and we can see those opportunities coming down the line. And I think the more the region can get organised, I think we are getting on the same page. We're not as coherent as we could be as far as selling ourselves or putting that picture forward, but it's certainly a hell of a lot better than it probably was even 2 years ago. And you give credit to governments, but also a lot of other stakeholders in the community for doing that. So I think we shouldn't discount that. Just being at the front of the queue and putting that best foot forward can really grab that attention as well, and then we've got the assets to make use of underneath that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo all those comments. I think it's on. Yep. I think that sort of knowledge economy is a really big one. That opportunity, we have the electricity demand here, so the green energy is going to flow here. What are we going to do with that? How do we embed that into products and materials and utilise that export through the port? But also looking sort of inland as well. Up in the Upper Hunter, we have these opportunities to reimagine some of the sites up there. There's a really good example at the Muswellbrook coal site where Idemitsu is planning in the one sort of site, a pumped hydro with an existing mine void. They're looking at a solar farm on site. They're looking at battery storage. They're looking at creating a light industrial precinct at that site. So there's all those opportunities. But I think the other sort of final point I'll make is there's opportunities within our zone, but there's also opportunities to support the other zones. So, the materials and stuff that are going to be needed as we build out the Central West Arana Renewable Energy Zone, as we build out the New England Renewable Energy Zone. I've been out there sort of the last week or so and talking to, the councils and things like that. There's going to be a huge amount of demand for workers and knowledge and experience as well. So, while they want to support local workers in those areas, they also know they won't have enough. So I think, the Hunter and Central Coast area can also be supplying that sort of expertise and skills as well.
This may not be appropriate, but I'm wondering why wave power hasn't been discussed.
Particularly at the moment.
No, I mean, that's a perfectly fine question. If you were going to say nuclear, we could discuss that too. But but I mean, I'll start with wave power. I think there's been quite a lot of work done in the past. There was a company out of WA that was doing some really good things. I'm aware of some projects that were proposed in Newcastle using sort of off the break wall and that kind of thing. I mean, I think it's a technology that certainly could play a role. It's just not there in terms of the maturity of other renewable energy technologies and the cost that's associated with that. So, we're in this sort of rapid deployment. All options are on the table, but the mature technology is getting sort of rolled out. The emerging stuff, it's still being looked at, but it'll take time, I think. And Jess might have anything to add.
No, I think you nailed it. Yeah, it's maturity and cost is just lagging. It just hasn't had the same development as wind. It's more technically difficult as well to do the wave power. It's more energy harvesting than generation. Like, it's hard to get a stable output. And if you think about, you get electricity from spinning magnets around, basically, and the faster you spin them, the more electricity you get. So it's a lower level of harvesting, but there's a lot of progress in the area, and I think it's just lagged behind just from lack of development and better options that are more easily deployable.
I'm just looking for a bit of clarification. Sorry. My understanding until now has been that blue energy was just made from gas.
Sorry, can you hold it this way?
That one? Sorry. The blue energy came from gas, not fossil fuels. What am I doing? Fossil fuels plus carbon capture, because my understanding also was the carbon capture doesn't really work, not very well. That, in spite of the millions that have been spent on it, it's not really working.
So blue hydrogen is from fossil fuels. So natural gas is a fossil fuel. So that's what you crack apart to get the hydrogen and then capture and store the CO2. Carbon capture and storage is quite contentious. Technologically, capturing carbon dioxide is done in a number of industrial processes, no problems. It's quite an efficient process. It's well understood. It's already industrial. It's been scaled. The difficulty gets around the storage aspect of carbon dioxide, also a bit concentration of CO2, so it varies in different processes. But storing CO2 is a bit more challenging, and one of the reasons is that it hasn't had, just like we were talking about with the wave power, it hasn't had the same technological development. Although money has been thrown at it, it's not the same scale of, so when you do carbon capture and storage, you store it away and you don't make money from it, right? It doesn't have a capital gain from it. There's no money to be made in carbon capture and storage. So although it's had investment, it's sort of been like box ticking investment rather than true actual investment in the technology development. And you should be skeptical of carbon capture and storage because it can be used as a band-aid to just keep using fossil fuels. That's not what we want to keep doing. In fact, the first step is to decarbonise and stop using fossil fuels. Doesn't mean we don't still need carbon capture and storage though. So when I talked about blast furnaces, we're still going to be producing carbon dioxide from those technologies. We need to do something with it. We can't keep releasing it. We're going to be quite reliant actually on carbon capture and storage to decarbonise in that short to medium term. And then long term, when I was talking about the upfront cost of installing renewables and technologies and the emissions involved there, if we don't want to blow our carbon budget, we're going to have to get to a point of pulling carbon dioxide from the air and sequestering it underground to try and claw that back to get us to a more reasonable level eventually. But yeah, so there's a bit of nuance there, and I don't think it's very black and white, like good and evil, but I would strongly advocate against using carbon capture and storage to prolong the use of fossil fuels. I don't think that's a positive way forward. Could be, yeah.
Hi, my name's Kath Elliott. My question is for Adam, and it's really about the acceleration of this program that you're leading, and it's very exciting. But it seems to me that there's an enormous amount of transmission, there's an enormous amount of renewable energy projects that need to be connected to the grid, so you mentioned all that. And I noted that you also talked about AEMO's recent ISP, and that they also note that acceleration of transmission is going to be a key factor in all of this. So my question is really around community and planning. And I have observed that in the renewable energy industry, there is a lot of resistance, particularly in country areas, for not only transmission lines, and we all know that a 330 kV line, big cage structure, is something that nobody wants. On their property or near their property. And then you've got, of course, wind, which also has similar concerns from people. They're concerned about the way they look, they're concerned about infrasound, all those sorts of issues. How are you going to fast track all of this, or accelerate, to use the government's word, when there's going to be quite likely a lot of pushback from communities. Is there going to be changes in the planning legislation to facilitate the renewable energy zones? And if you do that, does that mean that communities are going to have less of a voice about the projects and the transmission lines that need to be erected in order for you to achieve your objectives?
Great question. I think in terms of the last piece, I'm not aware of any plan changes to planning laws, and that's not a role that Energy Co plays. So we look at the sort of infrastructure planning. Absolutely, social licence and community support is going to be the key, and that's been noted in AEMO's ISP as well, about what governments and policymakers and developers need to start to consider in that regard. I think largely in terms of renewables, like particularly wind, in the right areas there's quite a lot of support. So there's landowner payments they receive, they're quite well compensated, and it's sort of emerged where some of the fight in the past was that the person hosting it got paid and the neighbour had to see it and they didn't get paid. But I think it's progressed past that point where there's also sort of knock-on payments for landowners that are sort of surrounding that. Ultimately though, that's a sort of decision for the developer to ensure they have that support, and that sort of feeds into whether they develop the project or not in terms of if they have that support and can get through the planning system. What we're seeing with transmission is we haven't had to build this extent of transmission in the last 15, 20 years. We've seen issues down in places like Victoria. So I think really there's a lot of work that can be done up front in terms of that land use conflict that I talked about. So a lot of the work we look at is, this has to happen, right? So we can't replace the generation in the existing zones. If we want to keep the lights on, we need new generation in the system. So what is the best location to run these sort of lines and connect it into the existing grid? How do we minimise that impact on the communities of where that's going? But noting that it will have to go through some areas, how do we then make sure there's compensation for those people that are affected, and how can we work with the community on a range of other programs that can help build that support? So previously with transmission, that there are a certain amount of payments that happen under sort of just terms compensation, but a lot of people are looking at extra sort of payments to make sure that they're well compensated for that impact. But in terms of sort of bringing community on board, obviously there's a narrative around the opportunity that it creates, but we're also working on what are the range of other different programs that we could help to roll out in these zones to support those communities. So at the moment we're sort of running a number of different studies around, with all this infrastructure, can we do improvements to the local mobile cell network, for instance, by hosting additional infrastructure and getting rid of cell black spots? Can we look at sort of road upgrades that are going to support this rollout but have long-term benefits? When we're housing and building this accommodation for workforce, how can we leave sort of legacy infrastructure that can be used for social housing or tourism and accommodation and things like that? And then what are some other sort of opportunities? So absolutely it's a challenge, and it's one that there's been a lot of sort of thought gone into it, but it's something that is going to have to continue to be at the centre of some of these decisions.
Okay, I think our last question.
Can I just have a really quick go at that one? Look, I think everything that Adam said there is spot on. I think part of it is there's been a historical shift in the expectations and the ability and the interest of community being able to engage and rightfully expect to be engaged on these issues. I think when we were building power stations or transmission lines or what have you, in previous decades they would just get done and people would get rolled over. And so I think now we're in a world where, and it's a good thing obviously that that's not how it happens, and people do have more capacity to push back. But at the same time as well, as Adam says, things need to get built, otherwise we're going to collectively be in real strife, and a lot of things are going to have to get built. And so that that raft of initiatives that Adam's run through is essentially what needs to be done. And it doesn't mean that every project will get up, but as far as making sure that procedural justice approach that people are engaged with properly, that they have every opportunity to have a say, that will resolve some issues for people, and the ability to make some changes in terms of where things happen and how they're done. That will help some people. Payments will help some people. The ability to have additional economic development initiatives in their regions will help, and then local jobs and local content will certainly help as well. But in terms of the speed of these things needing to happen, I think it's something that probably keeps a lot of people up at night, as far as how quickly these transmission lines and this power generation needs to be built for what we're looking at now, let alone everyone having an EV or making hydrogen or whatever it might be. And so I think there's trade-offs. We need to have and this is where maybe our policy and political system isn't quite fit for purpose at the moment, but it needs to be fairly utilitarian about how we deal with these issues and make those trade-offs right, so that everyone gets the best outcome they can in a situation while we get done what we need to get done.
Oh, boy.
My
Nice one.
question. We've had a lot of talk recently about people being job ready when they leave their education institution, which to me always assumes that knowledge isn't going to move and we're going to do the same thing forever. What role do you see education, universities and TAFE needing to do in order to produce the workforce for the future?
Just really easy questions tonight.
Funny you should mention that. So one of the other, I'll pass on, but I'll make some comments on that in terms of one of the areas that we're looking at the moment as well. We've sort of kicked off a study in terms of training and skills in the Central West Arana Renewable Energy Zone. We plan to do the same across each of the zones, but we're also working with the Department of Education, who is doing a sort of broader statewide industry skills study focused on the renewable energy industry. So understanding, what are the jobs that are going to be needed, what's in short supply, what are the timeframes, where's the intervention needed? So is it in high school, is it in, later, is it trades, apprenticeships, etc. So again, that's a challenge of making sure we have the right skills and experience ready for these builds, but also then understanding is there new facilities and things like that needed to support it. But I know Warren has a fair bit to say on training and skills as well, so I'll hand it over.
Sorry. I have a question on education as well, if you don't mind. I'd like to know what it is, what sort of guarantee or support will the New South Wales government give to young people, because at present it gives nothing. I mean, the TAFEs have been sold. There have been 20 TAFEs sold in New South Wales, and courses at TAFE now cost something like $10,000 for a young man when he leaves school, rather than $1,000 like it used to be. So what, if you need a workforce, you need to support young people who come from families who may not have those sorts of funds to train them. So what measures are being put in place for that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take that comment there. I don't work in the Department of Education or those kind of areas. What I do know of is, there's a course, in the renewable energy sector. So at the sort of local TAFE, there's a renewable energy engineering program that's been launched with the Hunter as the first sort of area to roll that out. In terms of other sort of initiatives and things like that around training and skills, I guess I can only talk from my experience and what I'm sort of focusing on at Energy Corporation. But yeah, I'll take your sort of comment there, and I'll hand over to Warwick.
Thanks. Yeah, look, it's no secret, right, as far as what's happened to the vocational education system. I think the challenge here for these particular industries and opportunities is what happens next. There's a few, there is a spinning of the wheels element around some of these issues, in that there's some difficult questions where they're industries with uncertain growth trajectories and in some ways uncertain skills needs. Some things we know, some things we don't, and that often becomes a barrier. But I think there is a power of work going on at the moment. Some of the things Adam spoke about, the challenge is bridging from those studies into what's the execution that's going to start making those pathways really clear for particularly for young people, but for some workers in affected sectors who may be looking to move over as well. The contribution that we've made, and I'll make a plug, I think it's my only one for the night, but the contribution we've made is we've looked at other states, and in Victoria and Queensland, the way they're tackling this is a little bit different to what we're doing here. So probably the best example is Federation TAFE and University in Ballarat, where what they did, they noticed in about 2019 that there was a hell of a lot of renewable energy projects going through the planning system in their neck of the woods, Western Victoria, and so they made an educated guess that there was going to be some jobs associated with that, and so they went and engaged with some of the major companies, Vestas, Tilt Renewables, a few others, and said, you're going to need some workers, can we do something about it? And so they got a business case between the TAFE, the uni and the renewable energy developers, and they used that business case and went to the state government, and they got $30 million to create an Asia Pacific renewable energy training centre, which is now built and has just started putting people through. They're training 600 people a year. Queensland's just done something really similar, and so we've been advocating for that proposition here, and got a lot of good feedback from experts and training organisations, essentially on that basis that there's a hell of a lot of renewables going on out west. We've got that won't be able to service that with the skills and the population they have. We have the ability and some initial programs already, and we can start training people here. And once we have that facility, then we're set up, because we're training people for an existing need, but we can convert that as we start to see some things that we don't quite know yet, but coming through hydrogen or what have you. So that's a proposition. We have got some interest out of TAFE who are looking into that prospect, and we're hoping that ties in with some of the other work that Adam and others are working on.
Yeah, that's brilliant work. I was going to say we need more back and forth between universities and TAFE and industry. So looking at what can we take from each of those that's actually going to benefit in a real way this renewable energy transition and the jobs that are actually needed. So obviously at the university we've got chemical engineering, and we've launched renewable energy engineering. So we're looking at the engineering jobs of the future, but it's not just about that, it's also about the actual trades and skills, because that's actually where most of the jobs, especially in the short term, are going to be. It's not so much in the higher levels, which will be needed eventually, and we certainly need them now. I mean, it's interesting talking about electrochemical engineering, because we don't teach that. I've made that word up because it's a new sort of field, which is why I said I'll tell you what it's about, because we've done electrochemistry and we've done engineering, but we've never actually tried to do it on a grand scale. So this is a new way of thinking for engineers that we need to start teaching, I think, and that the university is sort of taking a bit of a forward foot on. But I think that retraining aspect is also something really important that universities will need to play a role in allowing people who have already been established in an industry to train in a way that's not becoming a student again, but is getting the skills they need to go into a different industry, perhaps in concert with the TAFE and the skills that you could sort of bring together there.
Excellent. Look, we have gone over time, which doesn't surprise me. I mean, we've had 3 excellent speakers. I think it's been a great night. And yeah, we've been presented with some of the real challenges in terms of jobs, in terms of transmission, in terms of the social issues. I'm a bit worried about all these transmission lines going everywhere, and hopefully we can come up with more aesthetic ones and things like that. I'm reassured that it's not going to be half the state covered with solar panels, but it's actually a remarkably small area from what you've said. Yeah. And we're inspired by the excitement and about the research and everything. But anyway, so I'd like to thank our speakers for the night, and thank you for contributing so much. We were going to ask our newest member of the committee, Andrew Gibson, who's over there, who's been busily coordinating all the stuff, to do a vote of thanks, but I know we've gone on. So Andrew, and then what have we got planned? As I said, we will be staying here for the rest of the year. Hopefully the air conditioning won't be quite so cold next time. August the 10th, usual second Wednesday of the month, we're doing the housing crisis, the face of the housing crisis, and some innovative solutions that are being developed here. And then we're going to be a week late in September. And some of you may be aware that there's a proposal to merge the Greater Building Society and the Newcastle Permanent, and the chairs of the respective societies, Wayne Rogers and Jeff Ether, are going to be talking about why that's happening, and as well one of the academics from the business school will be presenting an overview of the changes that have been happening in the banking industry worldwide, which is part of the drivers as to why that may be considered. So that will be quite an interesting night, and there has to be a vote of all members of the building societies to approve that merger if it is to go ahead. I think both the Greater and the Newcastle Perm are much loved institutions in this community, and I think there'll be a lot of concern about that, but certainly interest. And the building societies actually approached us to run this forum because they recognise the need to engage with the communities, which we're quite pleased about. On October the 12th, we're looking at doing a session on the lessons from the pandemic. You will remember that there was a thing called a pandemic that hopefully will be moving into a post-pandemic phase, but we want to say what are the things that we have learnt both socially, from health and politically from the experience that we've been through. And then November the 9th, the end of the year, we're welcoming back Professor Michael Ondaatje. Some of you will remember him. He's spoken here before. He's a nationally recognised expert on American politics. We were trying to put together the topic that I'll be talking about. We thought, it's 3 months away. Who can tell what you'd be talking about in American politics? But it will be immediately after the midterm, so there'll be a lot to talk about. Michael is now the head of Humanities, Social Sciences and Languages at Griffith University, so his career continues to go on. But he's a great speaker, as some of you will know. So that's our plan for the year. So those of you who are new, please come up and find out more, and those who aren't, we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.